So for our third exam, we're going to be looking at a review, and this is over the entire course. So again, units 1, 2, and 3. A good resource is this video, but also if you are able to look at previous exams, they'll also be a good resource for the first two units. Third unit, this video is probably your best source as far as knowing most specifically what to look at and so on. So when we started the course, right, we started week 1, and what we really started with was this introduction to economics. And in that intro, we had an intro to econ. And in that intro, one of the first things we asked, or that we really looked at, is why do we care about econ? Why do we care, and what is economics? And with these two, to answer these two questions, the overarching, I guess the biggest thing that we saw with these was we have this idea of scarcity. That is, we have unlimited wants with only a limited amount of resources. And so what economics is looking at is, so when I think about econ, the big question we're looking at is how do we manage these scarce resources? And to do that, we had a couple different, I guess, philosophies that we might look at, or a couple different ways of organizing the economy. And one of the things we talked about was this difference between so we got into ways to actually organize the economy. And to do this, we ran into three categories. We had what's called a traditional economy, a command economy, and a market economy. And in our traditional economy, what we saw was this is an economy largely based off of tradition. So we do things the way we've always done them. Or the way they've always been done. So when you think about the traditional economy, what we may come in and see is, well, my dad did or my parents worked at one job, my grandparents worked there, so I'm going to follow in my family's footsteps. Or we may judge jobs based off of some observable characteristic of some sort. So we might say, hey, guys do this, girls do that. If you have brown hair, you do this. If you have blonde hair, you do this. If you have black hair, you do this, right? We may pick some sort of observable characteristic to decide what people should do and so on. And with the traditional economy, what we largely saw was there was little room for we see very little innovation or economic progress. The second group that we had was called the command economy. And with the command economy, what we saw was that this is a very centralized economy. And what we saw is that the government is largely making our economic decisions. And when we say economic decisions, what we're looking at largely is what gets produced. That is the quantity of goods to produce. And then what price do we charge for the goods? And when we think about what price to charge, that can also be thought of as how can we distribute the goods. In addition to what gets produced or how much goods get produced. We can also say how do they get produced. So the command economies can come in and say, well, you have to do. You might come in and when you came into college, they might say, well, you're going to take this test, and whatever this is going to directly determine your major. So whereas in our more of our market system, you get to choose, even if you choose something that you're maybe not naturally inclined to, you still get to choose your major and all that stuff. Command economy, we're just going to come in and say, hey, you're going to do what the state tells you to do and be happy with it. The market economy, we're going to say this is very decentralized. And instead of the government making these decisions, we'll see if the market makes those decisions. And when we refer to the market making these decisions, what we're largely looking at is the interaction between buyers and sellers. And if at any point you miss anything, I'll make this page available to you. So yeah, if you miss anything as we go through, this page will be available to you uh, as a PDF document or maybe as a shared document. I'll figure out how best to do that this afternoon, but that's there. So after we introduced our types of economies, we wanted to get more into looking at like, what combinations of goods can we actually produce? How do we decide stuff and so on? So what we introduced was the production possibility frontier. This is getting us into chapter 2. So we have the production possibility frontier. And basically what this is looking at is, again, what combination of goods can we produce if we use all resources? What combination of goods can we produce using all of our resources? And to answer this, what we would do is we would come in and we would make this chart or this graph, and we'd say we have two goods. So we'll have, say, fish and corn. And oftentimes what we would see is that this curve would take this bowed out shape. So it'll look something like that. And then on this curve, we have three types of points. We have, say, point A, point B, and we'll do, say, a point C out here. So we have three types of points that can come up, and we'll notice a couple characteristics from this. So the first thing we'll note is this bowed out curve, this bowed out shape. And this comes from our diminishing marginal return, where basically what that says is as I move from making one source to another, so if I move along the PPF, and I'll do this in gold, right? If I'm up here at fish, if I give up one fish up here, I gain a lot of corn back. But if I'm down here and I give up one fish, then I'm going to gain a relatively small amount of corn. And the idea of this is that as we get more and more and more producing only one good, we don't have as good of corn makers moving to that one field. So whereas another thing that was mentioned in this chapter was the budget constraint, but whereas a dollar, right? A dollar is a dollar. A $20 bill is a $20 bill. If I give you a 20 and it happens to have a 4 in the serial number, you're not going to say, oh, I don't want this because there's a 4 in the serial number, right? A $20 bill is a $20 bill. Whether I take it to a restaurant, a store, or an airport, wherever I go, it's worth the same. However, human our labor isn't necessarily like that. So if we just think about this from an academic perspective, two of the big fields that we hear about are math and English, right? So I'm going to pick on math and say reading, right? In general, you have some people who are really good at math, but really don't like reading. And I mean, like from a literature perspective. So you have some people that are good at math, but not so great at English. Then you have others who are great at English, not so great at math. You have some people who are just good at everything. You have some people who, aren't that great at everything. Um, so we have this bowed out PPF because of that diminishing marginal return. And as we move along this curve from one end to the other, we see that as we produce more fish, we see that as we give up a unit of fish as we go through, we give up fewer and fewer. We gain fewer and fewer corn. Oops. I'll just redraw that in a second. So that's what we're looking at with the PPF. Now on the other side of our PPF, what we're going to see is three types of points. So our types of allocations. And I put 3 points on here. You can probably imagine where I'm going with it. So you have three types of allocations. The first is going to be called an inefficient allocation. And this would be up here at point A. And what this is basically going to mean is that it kind of has two implications. The first, we are not using all of our resources. But the second interpretation or takeaway from this that we can see is a little bit more not something we think about, but we wouldn't think about outside of an economics course, but we can make more fish without giving up corn. And same thing, we can make more corn without giving up fish, and so on. So if I'm here at point A, right, if I wanted to, I could increase my consumption of fish, or I can increase my production of corn, or I can do some combination of the two, right? So A in this case would be considered inefficient. Our second one is point B, and this is going to be considered efficient. And again, the two interpretations first, we are now using all resources. So we're working as basically as fast or as much as we can, but also in addition to using all of our resources to make more fish, we must give up corn. So again, what that's going to look like is if I'm at B, I want more fish. Well, if I come up here, now I'm outside of the PPF, so I have to give up some corn. Hopefully not that much, but you kind of see, in this case, if I'm going to produce more of one good, I have to give up some of the other. Then our third point is point C. And this point is going to be considered unattainable. And this is unattainable given our current resources. But again, this is something that we cannot produce given the status quo. So given today's resources, today's technology, the number of people that we have working for us, whatever the case is, we're just not able to produce this quantity of goods. And it's unattainable, so I don't really have that second point for this one. So then after we got through our PPF, we really got into this idea of opportunity cost. And when we looked at opportunity cost, what we looked at is everything you have to give up to either attain an item, to attain something, or I'm going to rephrase that, is to attain a good or take an action. So for this, suppose that you have the opportunity to work or go. The big example that we kind of see with this is the opportunity to work or go to a movie. And our work situation, we're going to say it's for something like Uber. And I'm going to suppose that you make, say, $10 an hour. Whereas a movie is going to cost, say, $15 to attend. And we're going to say that $15 includes your ticket, your concessions, and all that stuff. So if we think about what's the opportunity cost to go to a movie, and suppose that the movie and it lasts 4 hours, or you have to give up 4 hours of work to go to the movie. The reason I pick Uber is because whereas a regular job, you have to clock in, clock out, maybe you have to be there for an entire shift. With something like Uber, you can just say, you just hit your phone, say I'm on, or hit your phone, say you're off, and then you can do that. So when we think about the opportunity cost to go to a movie, what we're going to say is that this is going to be the actual cost of the movie, but we're also going to notice that we lose out on wages by doing this. So plus our lost wage. So in this case, the cost of the movie we said was $15, but then we have to give up 4 hours of work, making $10 an hour. So this would be 15 plus 40. So the opportunity cost of going to the movie in this case is $55. And the other way that you can think about this is about this example in particular is if I were to go into a theater, excuse me, if I go to the movie, I'm going to be $55 short, or I'm going to have $55 less money than if I stayed out and worked. So again, opportunity costs just looks at everything we have to give up, not just what's the cost that goes out of my pocket to attend this event or to take this action. So we have our opportunity cost. And what this really, as we introduced opportunity cost, what we got into was a look at this idea of marginal analysis. And with this, what we did is really what we're doing is we're comparing the costs and benefits of taking an action, or I guess the proper term would be of choosing a little more or oops, let's spell little right, a little more or less of a good. So when we think about marginal analysis, what we would do here, so if we think about our movie example from above, right, we know that the marginal cost of attending, because we're thinking about this from an economic standpoint, is going to be $55. But when we think about our marginal benefit, what we're going to see is this is going to be equal to our value of the movie. Or the value of the movie to us. So we're saying, how much do I value attending this show, or what is it worth to me if push came to shove, what is it worth to me, or how much joy does it bring me? So if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, then we either buy more of that good or take the action. Right. So in this case, if that marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, I'm going to say, hey, I need to go in and just take this action, do whatever it is I want to do, or purchase the good that we're looking at. But on the other side, if our marginal cost is greater than our marginal benefit, then assuming this is an option, we either buy fewer goods or we don't take the action. So if I value a slice of pizza at 20 cents and somebody's charging $5, I'm just going to pass on it and say, okay, I don't really want it. So that's the idea of our marginal analysis. Again, we're just looking at the benefits versus the cost of taking an action. So after this, and I think that's basically our chapter 2. So we get into chapter 3, which deals with demand and supply. So when we looked at this, we got into we kind of got into talking about demand and supply. So what we start with this is a couple definitions, right? There's one fairly definition that we want to be confident about knowing the distinction between. And the first bit was demand or supply. And I'm going to format this. You'll see how it goes through, and I'll explain it. The format of this definition towards the end. So when you think about demand or supply, what we're looking at is how many goods a buyer or seller is willing and able to either consume or produce, or I should say purchase or sell at all prices. So when we think about demand, it's what a buyer is willing to purchase, and supply is what a seller is willing to sell or produce at all prices. So when we think about demand or supply, this is going to refer to the entire, more or less the entire economy. Or I should say the entire market, or the whole curve. So that's our demand and supply. However, on the other side, what we have is kind of a separate thing, and it's called quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So what we did for this was we would abbreviate this as QD or QS oftentimes. And quantity demand versus quantity supply, this one almost the same definition, but the distinction being that instead of being at all prices, we're going to look at a given price. So this would be 1 point on the demand or supply curve. And as we introduce demand and supply, or supply and demand, whichever way you prefer to do it, to say it, what we noticed was a couple traits. So as we get into the demand curve, we saw that this was downward sloping. And that downward sloping demand curve is going to represent the law of demand, or it illustrates, I guess, the law of demand. And the basic idea of law of demand is that, excuse me, as our prices rise, our quantity demand will fall or decrease. Then on the other side, we have our supply curve. And this would be upward sloping. And that upward sloping shape of the supply curve is going to represent the law of supply, which basically says that as prices rise, our quantity supply will rise as well. And the basic idea of this, if we think about law of demand, and I'll come back to law of supply in a second, but when you think about law of demand, as the prices go up, fewer people are going to see a benefit of purchasing a product, right? So, if Super Bowl tickets are say $5 a ticket, more people are going to say, "Hey, yeah, I'll go to a football game for $5." Than $2,000 a ticket. You're only going to have a select audience that's going to be willing to pay $2,000 to attend the Super Bowl. So we have these kind of things going on, and then law of supply, same thing, just the opposite. So at a low price, I may not be able to produce a good, or I might not be willing to go into a certain field given a lower wage or a lower price. However, if that price or wage goes up, or I see more opportunity in producing this good, I'm going to come in and start producing it, which means there are more people producing the good, and quantity supply goes up. And then with all of these, what we're looking at is so the overall relationship with demand and supply. I just kind of throw an illustration out just so we can see it again. And hopefully we're comfortable with what we're talking about. But so we have our price and our quantity, demand, and supply. And any point on our curve, I'm going to pick on these two for now, just because I can. So this point is a quantity demand. This point is a quantity supply. On the y-axis, we have our price, and in the middle, we had our equilibrium. And our equilibrium, I oftentimes note this point as like a Q star, right? Just saying, hey, that is the equilibrium quantity, then that also has an equilibrium price. So when we think about each of these curves, our demand is looking at price versus quantity demand, while supply is looking more at, I'm just going to scroll this down a little bit. There we go. So our supply curve is going to be looking at our price versus our quantity supplied. So then what we got into is a little talk about what's going to cause a shift in income, or excuse me, a shift in demand or supply. And we kind of got, and I say we talked, we're in an online class, so it's been a little different for us, but when we were looking through this, there were some things that came up where it said, hey, demand and supply, they've shifted, they changed. So from day to day, the market does not just stay the same. And if we think about like right now, we see that happening drastically. So if we think about something like gas prices, or the demand supply for gas, basically our entire spring break Memorial Day travel has, I guess not officially Memorial Day travel yet, but probably Memorial Day travel has really gotten messed up because even if I do go somewhere, most places there's not really much to do. And in our county, our county up in Iowa, we've started opening up where today we can go to a restaurant at half capacity. but we still can't go to barbershops or anything like that. And everyone's making a big deal about it. The only thing everyone acts like, oh, we're so free now when we go to restaurants. Is that the only new thing for us? But when we think about shift demand supply, when this virus came through and started its thing, you saw, and I'm going to pick on gas because we have not been buying gas either, just because, again, there's nowhere to go. And at least up by us, the area that, so our county has actually been hit pretty not bad. We have 12 or 16 cases in our entire county. But if you go just south of us, you're in the Des Moines area, which is like the largest city in the state of Iowa. And down there, they actually have a significant amount of more cases than we do. So, so they kind of like at least the state's kind of like, hey, if you don't have to, don't go to counties where, there's not, the outbreak is more prevalent and all that good stuff. We have our shifts in demand supply. So getting back on point, when we think about like the gas market, the market for gas, people aren't driving as much, so the demand for gas has nearly tanked, or not nearly tanked, it has tanked. So when you think about shifts in demand supply, these are going to be things or factors that are really not the price. Right. So when I think about my demand for gas, I am not consuming less gas because the gas prices are lower, right? Or whatever the case is, I am consuming less gas because there's nowhere to go, and if we do go somewhere, there's nothing to do, right? So you may as well just be home. We have these things that are not the price. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is look over or have handy the list of reasons, list of those factors. And in the textbook, and the textbook or the slides, and again, this is in chapter 3. Neither the textbook or the slides, maybe both. I know the slides for sure. I don't off the top of my head know about the textbook, but there's this graph. There's one for demand and one for supply. But basically it shows something like a demand curve. It shows an increase. Then it has a list of reasons why it would increase. Then there's a decrease. And it has a list of reasons why it would decrease. And same thing on the supply side. They're either in the slides or in the book. If you want to know exactly where, I can just send me an email and I can post that. But you want to have this handy because it's a nice little tool. And again, what this will look at is, again, what's going to cause demand or supply to shift, and so on. The overall theme that I want to just really keep in mind with that is that when we think about demand, or when we think about either one, an increase in demand or supply is going to be called a shift to the right. And then a decrease in demand or supply will be called a shift to the left. And then when we think about these shifts, we ran into, and specifically in shifting our demand, we ran into two types of kind of special types of shifts. So again, coming back to shifting our demand, we had income and what I've been calling relationships of goods. So when you think about income, right? We're either going to have, so we hopefully as we go through time, we have raises in income. We also at some points will have decreases in income, but it's not necessarily the case that just because I get a raise means I'm going to go out and buy more of a good. Or just because I have a cut in income, I go out and I buy less of a good. Um, right? And there's certain goods where as money goes down, I buy more of them. So when you think about income, we're gonna have two types of goods. The first is called a normal good, and it says that as our income rises, or an increase in income will lead to our demand to increase as well. And the other type is an inferior good. And when inferior good says that as income rises, our demand will fall. And on the other side, we had complements and substitutes, being how goods are related. So if we have substitutes, and for this, we're saying we have two goods, say good A and good B. So what substitutes say is that if the price of good A increases, this will lead to the demand for good B to rise as well. So today I go to the store and I get there and I'm going to the store to buy some pop or soda. Um, and I specifically want to buy Coke. But I get to the store and the Coke is like $20 for a 2 liter, which is a crazy high price. I may say, well, yeah, I'd rather have Coke than Pepsi, but I don't want to pay $20 for that 2 liter. So I'm going to go ahead and buy Pepsi. So that increase in the price of Coke led to an increase in the demand for Pepsi. And the other type of good we have are called complements. And these are goods that go together. So if the price of good A increases, then the demand for the other good will fall. So with the complements, suppose that we have a peanut. We're talking about peanut butter jelly sandwiches. Um, if the price of peanut butter goes up, then the price of the sandwich will also go up. But if the price of the sandwich goes up, this means I buy fewer sandwiches. And if I don't buy as many sandwiches, now I need less jelly. Now I need less jelly. So the increase in the price of peanut butter led to a decrease in the demand for jelly. Excuse me. So then we got into looking at with our demand supply, what happens if we're out of equilibrium, right? Or so yeah, just that. What if we are actually out of equilibrium? Or what are the three states of demand and supply? So with demand supply, we can either have it or the case where quantity demand is equal to quantity supply, which case we are in equilibrium. So when these two are equal, again, we have equilibrium. And basically what this means is that every good that gets sold, every good that gets produced at a given price gets sold, and everybody who's willing and able to purchase the good at the given price is able to buy it. So you might say at a given price, if QD is equal to QS, we're in equilibrium. If our demand is greater than our supply, then we have a shortage of goods. So if we think about something like the way that toilet paper has been acting over the past month and a half now, right at the current prices, everybody or a lot of people, they go out and they hoard up on toilet paper, and then but they're only able to supply the smaller amount, so they have a shortage. And what this will oftentimes indicate is that prices are too low. At least from the market's perspective, they're too low. And then the other case that we can have is if our demand is less than our supply, or QD is less than QS, in which case we have a surplus. And this will indicate that our prices are too high. And that, for the most part, is chapter 3. I think I'm just checking one thing out really quick before I move on. Okay. So the next little bit we got into, our chapter 4 largely is going to look at the labor and financial markets. So with these, what we basically saw was these act very similar to, these are going to act very similar to just supply and demand. And this, in fact, is an application of supply and demand. But a couple things that we will note with this is that we got into a little talk about productivity with this. And with productivity, what we looked at is what is the, we might say, what is the value of labor? Or what is the value of the product that you produce, right? So in this, what we're going to see is that as productivity increases, we are also going to expect our wages to rise as well. And the idea of this is, excuse me, the idea of this is that I'm going to come in, and if I'm productive, I can produce more goods. If I'm producing more goods, I just outright, I have higher wages. The way you can all kind of think about that is if you think about any type of work situation, if you work at, say, a restaurant or a store and they've been busy, right, then they need more workers, and the more productive you are, the more they're going to keep you on, the higher wages you get. But also, if your workers are very productive, you're going to see that other employers are going to come in and say, well, we found these folks are, this is a field where people are really productive in, so we can come in and hire these people. And you potentially have more competition of employers. Then we talked about shortages and surpluses already. So that, for the most part, is Unit 1. The second part that we get into is Unit 2. And I think that things really start moving a lot. I feel like once we get into Unit 2, things kind of roll smoother, at least on my end, they do. So Unit 2, we're looking at GDP, or excuse me, really measures of the economy. And the first part of this that we got into was, and the first thing we introduced with this is GDP, or our gross domestic product. And this, we can largely think of this as an income of the country. So the two ways we can think about it is, one, how many goods, what is the value of the goods the country produced, or we can think about what is the value of what a country has spent. But the key words that we're looking for with this we're going to have the value of our final goods. So these are goods that are ready to sell or at their final stage of logistics. So when I go out and I buy groceries, I buy my groceries for my household, not really to sell, but just to keep here. And once they leave our house, they're groceries. So once they leave, they're no longer useful for anybody else. So we have final goods and services, and these will be produced domestically. So when we think about production in this case, we're just looking at how is a good actually, where is the final point of assembly? And that's really what we're interested in. Where is that final point of assembly? Uh, and yeah, produced domestically. So international goods that are brought into the country don't really count towards our GDP. And what we saw with GDP is that in a healthy economy, or another way we can rephrase this is most high income countries, we tend to see let's say we tend to see this gradual increase in GDP over time. And that gradual increase is probably somewhere between like 1 and 3% a year. But I'm just going to mainly stick with just saying it's a gradual increase. Right. So what we mean by that gradual increase is it's going to be stable. It's just going to go up little by little by little as we go through time. We don't want it to be stable or we don't want it to just be sitting steady because then our economy is not growing. And we don't like really sharp increases or decreases just because, again, things can kind of get funny with that. Oh, that's cool. So we have our GDP, right? And that's our healthy economy. We have growth. And with GDP, one part of it was our trade balance, which in the formula was phrased net exports. And when we think about our trade balance, we kind of had three different situations that we can be in. So if our exports are greater than our imports, we're going to be said to run a trade surplus. And if our imports are greater than our exports, then we're said to run a trade deficit. And we got into trade balance a little bit, kind of looked at how that works and just looked at how that works with our trade balance. Oops. And then our trade balance again was that difference between exports minus our imports. And then towards the end of our GDP chapter, one of the things we got into was as we're measuring our GDP, the value of a dollar changes over time. So a dollar today is not the same thing as a dollar from 1950, or it doesn't have the same purchasing power. So what we got into was a little talk about nominal and real variables. And the key distinction between them was that our nominal is going to look at more or less the reported value, and this will not account for inflation. whereas on the other side we have our real values, and these will more or less account for inflation. And what we do with our real values is we're going to hold a steady unit of value. If that's how I want to, yeah, that's how I'll say it. So what I mean by that is we'll hold the purchasing power of, say, a 1980 US dollar is the same today as it was in 1980, right? Because we're just going to use the prices from 1980 and roll them over into today or yesterday or whatever we're interested in. Sales real and nominal. The main distinction that we'll have is that real will account for inflation, while nominal will not account for inflation. So then what we got into was a quick chapter on productivity. And when we think about productivity, and this was, oops. So we got this chapter on productivity. And what this is largely looking at is what is the value of what a worker actually produces. And oftentimes this will be measured not necessarily always, but I'll just make that little note. Often this will be measured in dollars per labor hour. And then when we looked at productivity, we had these elements or these factors of productivity, and we had our physical capital, which is largely the tools that are available. We had our human capital, which largely is our education. We had natural resources. So what resources are available in an area, right? If we live in an economy where oil is like really important, it's good to have oil in under the ground, right? And stuff like that. So we have those natural resources, and then we had technology. And when we think about technology, this is really looking at what does society's knowledge. Okay. How well do we know how to produce goods? How many best practices do we know? And so on. And with these factors, we saw one of the things that we looked at is if we increase either human or physical capital, and I'll make a little note that this is per person, we run into this thing that's called capital deepening. And it just means either in the sense of human capital, the average worker, the average person is becoming more educated, or in the sense of physical capital, we're giving more tools for people. So after our productivity, we got into unemployment. And unemployment for right now is probably really straightforward, hopefully. At least hopefully on my part. So when we think about unemployment, we ran into so our population can be divided into three groups. And for this, the first that we have is our employed. And these are people who work for pay, basically. So we have a job, we're going out, you work every day or most days, whatever the case is for you. You go out, you work, you get paid for that work. The second group we have is our unemployed. And this means that you are out of work, but still looking for work, but looking for a job. And we define looking as in the past 4 weeks. Then our third group was those who are not in the labor force. And this crowd that's not in the labor force. They are out of work, but they're also not looking for work. And the groups that we saw with this one would be, or some common groups that we saw with our not in the labor force would be our students and traditional full-time students and retirees. So full-time students and retirees. Then we have, I think the preferred phrase now is domestic housekeeper. So somebody who stays home and takes care of the household. And then we have discouraged workers. And these are people who they tried to find a job and they've worked, but excuse me, let me rephrase that. They're people who maybe they're laid off or whatever the case, but they've been trying to find a job, but then they get discouraged or discouraged. So they say, you know what, I've tried to find a job and I don't care anymore. So or maybe not necessarily don't care anymore, but they've tried and nothing's coming up. So they give up on that job search. They just say, hey, I'm done for now. So we have, again, those discouraged workers. And when we thought about unemployment, what we got into, we had kind of two formulas that came up. The first was the unemployment rate. And this was equal to our unemployed workers, or the number of unemployed, divided by our labor force. And our labor force, if we remember, was just equal to our employed plus our unemployed. Then we talked about the labor force participation rate. So just write that out, labor force participation rate. And this was equal to our labor force divided by the population. And excuse me, both of these are times 100. And that just gets it into a percentage form for us. So the labor force participation rate, in this case, the population is equal to our labor force plus those who are not in the labor force. So if I scroll up really quick, and I'll scroll back down there in a second, these first two are going to be the labor force. All three of these put together are going to be our population. And then the second unit ended with a quick talk on inflation. So we talked about inflation, and with this what we saw was a gradual increase in price or in prices over time. And one of the things that we saw that could come up with inflation is this idea of deflation. And deflation is basically just a negative inflation. Or when across the economy, prices actually go down. And then with inflation, one of the things we got into was dealing kind of with interest rates and how do they actually work out. So what we got into was a talk about real inflation or real interest rates, which would be equal to your nominal your nominal rate minus your inflation. And what this real interest rate is going to look at is how does your purchasing power change with some financial product. So with an account or investment. So if I have a portfolio and say all my stocks go up by 3% this year, but there's also 3% inflation, I'm not going to have any increase in purchasing power. However, on the other side, if we have, say, a 10% increase in my portfolio, but only a 2% rise in inflation, I'm going to have an 8% increase in my purchasing power. So that's what this little bit's looking at. And with that, everything should work out for you with inflation. So again, two key things. And right now I'm focusing more on what I have on the exam, not necessarily what's not there. So just something to keep in mind as we go through this. So when we ended, that's you never got examined over slide it. Cool. So after our inflation, we got into aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And what this chapter did, and it was chapter 10, what this really did was it just tied, at least I think it really tied everything together. So aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And what this looks at is demand and supply, basically, for the entire economy. Hence the phrase aggregate. And for this, what we looked at was we had a downward sloping, my bad. On this one, instead of just having price and quantity, we had our price level. Then we had our Y, which would be our real GDP. Then we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, a short run aggregate supply that looks something like that, and a long run aggregate supply that's vertical. So when we think about both of these, again, what we're looking at is either aggregate demand or aggregate supply. We're looking at the price level versus the total excuse me, let me just see how we have this phrase. And the total quantity or total value of, I guess, total quantity of goods that either consumers purchase or firms produce. I'll make that notion I made earlier. Aggregate demand for that. Oops. Aggregate supply for what the firms produce. So when we think about how we can, really get things going with this, we got into was just that. And this long-run aggregate supply can also be thought of as full employment, GDP. Or potential GDP, whichever is relevant. Excuse me. So we had that, and when we thought about this, what we got into was really two types of situations that came up. Oops. And excuse me really quick. So we had really two types of situations that came up, or two types of equilibriums, we might say. The first is more of a short run equilibrium. So if we're in the green spot, we have a output and a price level. And the green dot, where we have Y star and P star, is going to be more of a short run, or more of like the current state of the economy. So it tells us what's actually been realized and really what's going on with that. But then on the other side, oh boy. Then on the other side, what we have is more of a long run equilibrium where, again, we're going to be more up here. I should probably make that in red to make some distinguishing. So with this red point, we have some output, but this one is actually equal to our long run aggregate supply. So this just tells us, again, what are we able to produce if with full employment? Or when things are running smooth. And then a couple states that we can see with this. Sorry, my little notes have been acting up a little bit. So when we think about interpreting this, a couple things we can see is this difference between long run aggregate supply and our output is related to, and not exactly the same thing, but it's related to our unemployment. So we don't just want to say, well, we could produce $20 trillion of goods, but we're only producing 16 trillion, so we have 20% unemployment, right? Not really how we're going to see that. But we introduced was this idea that came up, and when times are really bad, we get into what's called stagflation. And what this will denote is an increase in inflation and an increase in unemployment. So in general, when times are not great, we expect to see prices fall. And to some degree, we've seen that within recently, where people aren't working, but during this time, gas prices have fallen. Depending on what types of goods you're looking at, maybe there are certain sales going on where it's like, well, we need to get inventory moving. So there might be more sales going on. Prices could be lower right now. They could also be higher because firms need to cover some overhead or make up for some lost revenue over the past couple months. But stagflation high means we have high unemployment and high inflation both at the same time. Then when we looked at our stuff, let's just keep on rolling. And excuse me really quick. So as we think about our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and I'm going to draw a new one just so it's a little more easier to see, a little bit of a neater one. So we have our price level and our output. We have short run aggregate supply that looks something like this. Then we have our long run aggregate supply that comes in somewhere around here. Then we have our aggregate demand, which I'm going to put fairly low for now. So we talked about how the little gap here can represent unemployment. And again, this is not a direct measure for it, but rather just a representation of high versus low. And we're going to suppose, for the sake of now, that we have an increase in demand, or aggregate demand, that puts us up to say, that was not necessary. Oops, my bad. Sorry about that. That will be right back up. Where'd it go? There it is. My bad. I hit X. I was moving a little bit and I hit the wrong button by accident. But we have aggregate demand. Suppose we have an increase in aggregate demand. So we're going to see our equilibrium jump from red up to green, somewhere along there. But we see what this happen is a couple things. You see a new output or new GDP, so Y0 will go up to Y1. But we also see new price levels. So this Y0 up to Y1 demonstrates our growth, and from P0 to P1 is going to show our inflation. Again, this exam, it's not really a math-heavy exam, so if I'm leaving certain formulas out, take that however you want to mean that. But we have this inflation, growth, unemployment is really what we can see with this, with our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and it really makes for what I think is a really nice diagram that really ties together the entire second unit. So that is that part. So as we keep moving, and we're getting more into our third unit now. Excuse me. The first thing we really got into is we were introducing money and policy. So with unit 3, again, we're looking at money and policy and the financial system, monetary policy, and so on. So when we think about this, what we're looking at is first, there we go. Looking at first is, why do we have money, right? So why do we have money? And the reason for it is largely it makes our life easier. It makes our lives a lot easier. So the first thing is, what if we had a world, what if there was a world without money? What would we be like? What would we be doing? What we would be in is a type of economy that's called a barter economy, or a barter system of trade. And with this is where we trade goods for other goods. And as you can imagine, since I'm trading goods for goods, then there is no money involved. And this kind of becomes a little bit of a pain because we have that double coincidence of wants where, right, I have to have, in order for a trade to happen, we both have to want the same thing. Or I have to have something you want, you have to have something that I want, which, can sometimes maybe be a pain. So instead, what we do is we introduce this idea of money, or we introduced money. It's not an idea, it's a thing, but we introduce money. And its purpose is, it really has three purposes. The first is to act as a medium of exchange. That is, this is what we actually trade with. This is where if I need something, I give you money in exchange for some other good. The second thing we'll see with this is a unit of account. And the idea of the unit of account is that it just gives a universal or a more universal sense of value. So we kind of know that crab is more expensive than chicken, right? We understand that whether you like, uh, right, whether you prefer chicken, you prefer crab, you're a vegetarian, whatever the case is, uh, as a society, we've come to expect that, hey, a crab is worth more than a chicken in terms of meat per ounce or meat per pound per ounce, whatever the case is. So we have a unit of account, which is basically a yardstick of value. And then the third big thing we had was called a store of value. And basically, the idea of this is that I can take my money today and I can save it for tomorrow. So if you think about certain types of goods, so if I think about something like milk, if I try and save my milk for 10, 15, 20 years, it's not going to be good then. However, for something like our currency, it's a little bit more of a, it's a little bit more, how do I put it, versatile or durable, where again, I have my $20 bill. If I take a $20 bill and I throw it in my safe or I throw it under my pillow, whatever the case is, in 20 years from now, that $20 bill is still going to be worth $20. Now, it may lose some purchasing power, so I may not be able to buy as many stuff as I could today, but that $20 bill remains $20 whether I spend it today or I save it for retirement or whatever the case may be. So money really has these three main purposes. And as we went through money, we got into looking at how much money is there. And when we looked at how much money there is, we really got into two main types of money. So we introduced this M1, which would be equal to M1 would be equal to our currency or the cash that we have on hand, plus our demand deposits, plus either like a traveler's or a certified check. Then the second type of money that we have is called M2. And M2 is going to be equal to everything in M1 plus our savings accounts plus money market funds. And then we have so savings, money market, and CDs or time deposits. So with the CD, what we'll do is we'll say, I'll go to the bank and I'll say, hey, I have say $1,000 to save. I want to put it into a CD. They'll say, okay, in 5 years or in a year, whatever the term you agree on, we'll pay you back this much if you keep it in for the full time. So then after we introduced kind of what these different monies are and how to calculate them, there was a little talk, a little section about credit and debit cards, or plastic money. And the overarching theme of this is debit or credit cards are not money and do not create money. But rather act um, as a tool to transfer money. So if I go to the store and I use my debit card or a credit card or whatever the case is, um, the card itself is not money, right? I can, if something happens to one of my cards or my debit or my credit card, I call the company, say, hey, my card's been stolen, they cancel, it's deactivated. Whereas if it were money, you could just take it anywhere, and there's really no way to stop the flow of money if it's in people's hands. However, what the debit or credit card do is they authorize the movement of funds. So if we have a debit card, so kind of what a debit card purchase is going to do is, and again, key emphasis on this one is for a debit card. This is going to take money from a debit card purchase will take money from your checking account to your retailer's checking account. So this will move money from your M1 account and it'll go to the retailer's M1 account. So again, all the card does is says, I take it, I use it somewhere, and it tells my bank, in this case, that, hey, it's telling my bank that, hey, I want to buy this, and I want you to move money from my account into their account. And that makes both me and the vendor happy. On the other side, we have our credit card purchases. And it's going to act pretty much the same way. That is, it's going to tell the credit card company, hey, we need to move money from one to another. But in this instead of moving it from your account, this is instead going to go from the credit card company's M1 account. And we'll put it again into the retailer's M1. And then the credit card will add this purchase to your balance. So let's say, hey, we paid this retailer, so now you owe us for what we just paid the retailer. Oftentimes we can think of the credit card as being like it's spotting you for however much money you're requesting. And yeah. So that's our money and kind of more money in general of what it is, how it works, and so on. But then we got into our financial system. And with our financial system, we have our central bank, which organizes the. So with this, we have a central bank, and the primary function is to stabilize our financial system. And in the U.S., the central bank is called the Federal Reserve. Which recently has been getting a lot of coverage, a fairly decent amount of coverage with the Federal Reserve. They basically today, or not today, but right now, they're basically saying that, hey, here's a blank check, do what you need to do. Which I don't know. We'll see how that works out. But Federal Reserve is our central bank. They oversee safety, stability of our banking system. So within our banking system, a couple things that they do is they're going to have a couple requirements. So with them, what they get into is they say first we have a couple tools they have. One of them is going to be reserve requirements. And what a reserve requirements say is that a certain percentage of deposits, so a percentage of deposits must be held in reserve. Then we had our, excuse me really quick. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so we're good. So we have those reserve requirements. Then we have a second thing we saw was capital requirements. And basically this says that a percentage of your assets must be a part of your net worth. Or the bank has to own own a certain percentage of itself. So basically what this means is that I can't just start up a bank and go take $100 from everybody in our class and say, "Yay, I have a bank, let's make loans." Instead, what I have to do is I have to, if I'm going to start a bank, I have to either through my investors or through my own funds, come up with some initial background just so I have some skin in the game is basically the idea of that. And then uh, for now, that's the tools I'm going to focus on uh, for now. And when we think about our policy, what we introduced was two types. Right? So we talked about expansionary monetary policy. And what this does is it's going to really increase the money supply. So again, this will increase the money supply, and the idea of this is going to be to increase loans, which will lead to an increase in our GDP. So expansionary monetary is meant to really grow the economy, speed things up, and so on. The other type we have is contractionary monetary policy. And this will decrease the money supply. And this will really work to, and this will decrease our loans, which will, the idea is to decrease GDP. And we may also think of this more as decreasing the growth of our GDP. So we have our contractionary. Again, the idea of this is to kind of slow things down to keep inflation under check. So we like expansionary. It's good when unemployment is of concern. And our contractionary will be good when inflation is a concern. And we put these two together. When we think about, well, what is good policy? Normally, we use what's called, normally a central bank will use what's called countercyclical policy. And basically what this does is this is policy that pushes pushes our economy in the opposite way that it's going. So you mean by that, this isn't saying, oh, well, when times are good, we're going to just shut it all down and get into a recession. But when times are slow, we're going to be interested in the expansionary policy, right? So right now, when nobody is working and everything is slowed down, we're not too worried about inflation, right? And right now, inflation is the least of our concerns. The the president of the Dallas branch of the Federal Reserve Bank even a little more in depth with that. I was like, well, inflation really won't, based on what we're seeing right now, inflation won't be a concern for a couple of years. And same thing with interest rates potentially. That's what the Dallas Federal Reserve president said. Not that's what I heard from him. But we have that countercyclical policy. When times are good, we pass contractionary. However, when times are not so great, we pass expansionary. And the reason for that is we don't want to, well, when times are bad, you don't want to make things harder. But also when times are good, you don't want to be passing the stimulus, which could lead to bad times with inflation. And so this is our deal with the Federal Reserve, the main stuff that we're looking on for the sake of the exam. So as we keep going through, we're getting towards the end of our at least the end of this part of the session where I'm talking, and we're getting into more of the fiscal policy side of things. And we think about fiscal policy, this is that which deals with more of government spending and taxes. And this is done through basically through Congress. Let's make sure it looks like a C, not a G. Through Congress and the president. So when we think about our fiscal policy, what we're looking at is, or the first kind of thing we looked at is the government budget. And we saw kind of three things that we can relate to with our spending and our taxes. So on one end, we can have our government spending can be either greater than, less than, or equal to our taxes. The first case I have is if our government spending is greater than our taxes, we're going to be said to run a budget deficit. Again, I'm putting out more than I'm bringing in, so we have to take on loans, which means we're running that deficit. On the other end, if my government spending is less than my taxes, then we're going to be considered to be running a budget surplus. And if we have equality, so if our spending is equal to our taxes, we're going to be said to have a balanced budget. And as we think about this, and this is something that I've kind of been more mindful of mentioning this semester than previous. When we think about government spending and taxes, these are two separate things, right? So, and if you just think about what's been going on recently between, I think, 2018 or 2017 and today. So in late 2017, for the 2018 tax season, we introduced the tax cuts, right? We said, hey, we're going to pay less taxes and so on. And people got some money back on their, well, they didn't get money back, but their paychecks went up by a little bit. So we have this, our taxes. In 2017, early 2018, late 2017, the government passed a tax cut, which was a tax bill. More recently, we're talking about stimulus packages, and we're talking about all this good stuff. And when we're thinking about our stimulus packages, these are going to be spending. One of the things you don't see in the stimulus package is anything about the tax code, really. And the 2020 tax code is already written. Your tax tables are already available. So they're not going to change the tax code for 2020 because we passed a new stimulus package. So again, we think of these as two separate things, And as you go through, you'll want to, because it'll kind of work out. It'll work out nice if you do it that way. So when we think about our taxes, we ran into really three types of taxes that we can have, or three types of taxes, I guess. First type we talked about was a progressive. And basically what this means is that as your income, this basically means that those with higher income pay a higher percentage of that income. So the more money that I make is the more money that I pay. Or I should say is a higher percentage or share of your income. The other type that we had was called a regressive. And this means that those with higher income are going to pay a lower share of their income. And then we had a proportional. And basically what the proportional said is that we have a flat tax rate. A flat tax rate of your income earned, and that is regardless of your income. And then from there, so when we're thinking about that, suppose that we have so when we're thinking about, well, is the tax system progressive, regressive, or proportional? You want to be able to work through a couple examples that deal with that. So suppose that we have John and Peter. And so we have our income and suppose they have an income and a tax bill or a tax liability. We're going to suppose that John makes $30,000 a year and Peter makes, say, $100,000. So their tax bill is, suppose that John pays a $5,000 tax while Peter pays, say, a $20,000 tax. Then we say, what is their tax rate? So for John, the tax rate will be 5,000 divided by 30,000 times 100 to get it into a percentage. So that's 5 over 30, which is 1/6. So, oops. Sorry. 1/6 is like 0.18 something. I'm just getting my calculator to get an exact number. My bad. That's about a 16.7% tax. Whereas for Peter is going to do 20,000 divided by 100,000. So we have 100 in that. It's 100,000, not 10,000. So 20 over 100 gives us, well, 20 over 100, which is 2 over 10. So Peter would be paying a 20% tax rate. So since Peter, with a higher income, pays that higher tax rate than John, this system would be considered a progressive income tax. And if we ran into a system where it said, well, suppose that we're talking about for one good. So suppose we have the same people, but a tax on their tax now is, say they buy a product where they spend a $10 tax on that item, or say they spend $100 tax on some item that they just bought, right? So if they both spend $100 tax, then John would have a 0.3% tax, and Peter would have a 100 divided by 100,000 would have like a 0.1% tax. So where this comes into play is something like where people refer to this as something like an excise tax on cigarettes or tobacco. Um, this is a good where if you're a smoker, you don't. I don't think that you're gonna say, "Well, I made an extra $1,000. I made an extra 70,000, so now I'm going to. I made an extra 70,000, so I'm going to just buy 5 cartons of cigarettes a week, right? Probably not how it's going to work. Probably going to purchase the same amount, no matter how much you make. So for something like this, that would be a regress. This one would be a regressive, even though it's the same. No, it's the same number of dollars for both people. It's a smaller percent of their income, so it's going to be a regressive. Um, and yeah. So for that, that's pretty much what I have as far as the exam goes. I'm going to get the recording canceled, and then if anybody wants to, I'm going to get the recording stopped, and if anybody needs to talk, we can talk.